Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Data with Bill Live, presented by Humanlytics. My name is Bill Su, the CEO and co-founder of Humanlytics. And today we have with us James Williams, who is a UX strategist at Message Agency, a design company that designs websites for impact-driven organizations. Thank you for joining us today, James.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
One thing that really impressed me about James, so we work in few projects in the past collaborating together during the Venture for America training camp, is that whatever problem he's faced with, he always have a very elaborate and scientific approach to all these problems. And the process that he uses is called human-centered design, which is very, very popular right now in almost all realms of businesses. So today we have him to give us a brief introduction about human-centered design for us. So James, why don't we just begin by you telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a current first year Venture for America fellow, and as Bill mentioned, I'm working at Message Agency, which designs sites for nonprofits and other impact-driven organizations. And at Message Agency, I'm a UX strategist. So what that entails is, in a sentence, translating from research insight to design action. So human-centered design is very focused on user research and on other aspects of research. And so my role is really sort of like shadowing, doing the research and then translating that to actual design decisions.
That makes perfect sense. So one thing that really impressed me about you before, and we had this conversation beforehand, is that your approach to design is really impact-driven. And LinkedIn, your profile is saying that you are a designer with a mission. So can you just give us a little bit idea about how you get into designing and what you mean by designer with a mission?
Definitely. So my entry into design, like a lot of other designers that you'll talk to that are in UX or human-centered design, is pretty non-traditional. So my childhood dream was to be a doctor. So I went to Brown University with that intent. And I started studying a lot of, obviously, the physical sciences and the life sciences, but also a lot of social sciences, and really starting to understand that a lot of health problems are social in nature, and they are determined by a lot of things such as access to safe housing or nutritious food that aren't really in the purview of the medical system in the U.S. And so I ended up starting to think about these problems as problems that were outside of the system. So I took this class that was an ethnography class called Design Research, and it was all about how you do research into problems that people have and understand sort of some of the root causes and why they behave the ways that they do, and then from there begin to create solutions and interventions that are design driven and that really respond to those needs. So I did a fellowship in Cape Town that was all around health innovation and entrepreneurship, and really understanding the needs and being able to design human-centered solutions that will actually be things that are desirable by the people that have to use them, things that are viable given business and the marketplace, and things that are feasible in terms of technological constraints. And from there, I really had a good experience in that project. I learned a lot. It was definitely a large learning curve, and that encouraged me to pursue design more seriously, and had already been exposed to entrepreneurship and the power of how design can create solutions, but entrepreneurship can scale those solutions and really have an impact. And that was kind of my first foray into design.
That makes perfect sense, and that's a really good story. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of very successful organizations nowadays, I think Airbnb is an example that you gave me, and also I can think of Apple, they succeed and they excel because they have great design, and they are able to impact people's lives because they have great usable design for people to use their products very easily. So yeah, that's a very awesome story. So let's just get into the dirt. Let's just get into human-centered design. Why don't we just start by you introducing us a little bit about what is human-centered design in the first place?
Yeah, so human-centered design at its core is a framework for understanding, defining, and addressing problems. So it's sort of agnostic in the type of problem it can solve. The core of the framework is really about, at the starting phase, understanding what the problem is. So that phase in a lot of different frameworks can be called the empathize phase. Mm-hmm. So that's where you're doing a lot of the heavy research, mostly behavioral in nature. So borrowing from techniques from the social sciences, such as ethnography, and really sort of observing people and their context of use around whatever problem space that you're interested in. So, for example, if you're interested in the health space, you would talk to and observe people either in their homes or in a healthcare setting. And so once you have an understanding of what the human behavior is, then you will go into a phase that is generally called define. So that's where you might have come into the project with your assumptions about what was going on and what the problem was. But in this phase, you take the information that you gathered from research and you really start to say, oh, so this is actually the human need. These are the problems. This is the context that I'm trying to address. And so you'll come up with a few problem statements that allow you to say, okay, I understand that this is the problem that I'm addressing based off of research, not just my own assumptions. Mm-hmm. And so once you have a few, ideally one central problem statement, you move into an ideate phase where you start to think more creatively about the different ways that you can address this problem. So one thing that's really important about human-centered design is to be problem rather than solution focused. So a lot of times people, when they're designing a product or when they see an area of opportunity, they'll immediately jump to solution. So the first two phases, empathize and define, you want to suspend solution thinking. You want to just say, what's the problem I'm addressing? How do users behave? What are their attitudes, motivations, beliefs, etc.? And ideate is the first phase where you start to say, okay, this is what's going on. Now I want to think about possible ways to address it. So the key here is to really visualize your ideas and think about things in a way that can be communicated with and kind of like put in a tangible format. And that sets you up well for the prototype phase, where you're actually testing your ideas either with your team or with the users. And after you have some feedback, you refine that prototype, and then you move into a more high fidelity prototype and you test that, and then more rounds of feedback, and then you might ship. And I've sort of presented this process in a linear fashion, but it's very iterative in nature. So moving from ideate to prototype, you might get some feedback that pushes you all the way back to empathize. You might have to say, oh, this is an area that didn't really come up in the first phase of discovery, meaning empathize and define. And you might like go back and explore at a more granular nature. So you kind of move back and forth across that kind of continuum that I described.
That makes sense. So emphasize, define, ideation, and prototype. Got it. One thing that you said that really strikes me during the conversation is that you said that people tend to jump into a conclusion, and we should avoid doing that in human-centered design process. So as many of you know, I'm in China for a consulting project right now, and that is like one of the single biggest problem I see my clients have. It's just like they don't even define problems clearly. They don't even know what they're solving the problem for. And they just say, okay, yeah, I think this is a great solution and let's solve it. But the solution ends up not meaning anything. It doesn't have any concrete impact because they're not really solving solution for the problem's sake, but just for the sake of like having solutions. So that really resonate with me. So thank you so much. That's awesome. So let's dig into each of the processes, I guess. So I guess like the first phase is emphasize and define, and you said that requires like some user researches, right? So can you just go into a little bit deeper into the two processes and what you should do in terms of engaging with users in those two processes?
Yeah, so that phase kind of has a lot, sort of two different main phases. So the first phase is really about understanding what's happening. And so you'll use different user research techniques, being focus groups, interviews, participatory design workshops. So a participatory design workshop would be an instance in which you would not just talk to users, but you want to understand how they behave around different concepts or different products. And this is because there's something that's known as the say-do divide. So when you talk to people, they will say one thing, but when you observe their behavior, you'll actually notice some inconsistencies. And so you really want to design for the case of behavior, because that's going to be how your design is like addressed and used in the real world.
I see.
Yeah.
I guess like one of the classic thing I hear from people is that users don't know really what they want in the design process, and they don't know what can really solve their problem. So what's your opinion on that statement?
I would say, so that comes back to the say-do divide. If you ask a user, what do you need? It's going to be difficult for them to answer that. And a large part of the reason is because they're either not aware of those inconsistencies between what they say and what their actual behavior might imply. And it's also because the role of the designer is to collect those insights and to really move from behavior to an actual solution. So it's not that they don't know what they want, but it's the role of the designer to sort of translate from needs to a design solution.
I see, that makes sense. And just my take on that, you'll also see that like even if Steve Jobs will tell you that designers don't know what they want, they're actually addressing a problem, especially with like the initial MacBooks in the design community of having like a larger power and more beautifully laid out computer. So they are applying in some way design thinking process and human-centered design process in the early stage of Apple as well. So just to throw out there, because I think that's important to not confuse users do not know what they want with the human-centered design process. I think the human-centered design process helps you flush out what users actually want.
So that quote also is in reference to not being able to see past the innovation curve. And this kind of has to do with how fast technology advances. So he was kind of talking about how if you ask someone what they want, they're only going to be able to think in terms of what's already out there. So this is really a quote that's applicable to an innovation state. So they won't necessarily know like, well, actually, technology has just made this sort of small leap, so this is possible. Whereas someone who is more in touch with the design world or the tech world might have that knowledge to be able to think through that solution.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So let's talk a little bit about the gist of user research process, because I realize that for a lot of people that I talk to, they are really afraid of talking to users. They don't know how to communicate with them, and they don't know like what they should avoid when talking with them in order to get the most real answer from the user. So can you give us a little bit idea of how to, like the gist of what to avoid and what to pay attention to when conducting like a specific user interview?
Yeah. So generally in an interview setting, you want to go in with an understanding of what the problem areas that you want to tackle in that interview. So one pitfall that people have is just being very sort of broad and generic in an interview. So you want to have a few key points that you want to hit, not in the sense of like prescribing an answer, but just knowing that I have these 4 topics that I want to talk about is a good place to start. Having going in with a research script, meaning you have the questions that hit those key points, is good as well. Keeping in mind that it's unlikely that you will stick to that script. In fact, you shouldn't stick to that script. It's just sort of to keep the interview flowing if you might hit a snag or something of the like. You want to ask open-ended questions, and really when you're evaluating an answer or noting down an answer, you want to think about their tone. You want to think about their facial expressions. An interview gives you the opportunity to gather a lot of rich data, so you want to be noting their behavior as well. It's also a good practice for there to be 2 people interviewing. So one person who is sort of like moderating the interview, so that's the person asking the questions, and then the second person is really just observing and taking notes. And the last thing would be when you go into an interview, you want to kind of like set the stage for the interview. So, break the ice a little bit, have a little chit chat, introduce the purpose of whatever project you're working on, why it's relative or a benefit to them, kind of like, give them a little context for it. Want it to be as conversational and organic as possible. And then after the interview, you want to have a little bit of a debrief with them as well.
I see, that makes sense. Thank you so much. There are a lot of very good content here. For example, like having 2 people to interview and make sure not to ask general questions. Thank you so much on that. So I guess the next questions, let's move forward into the human-centered design process. So one thing that you mentioned is that the entire process is very iterative. It means that you probably need to go back and forth between different stages constantly in order to make sure that you're really building something the user needs. So can you just give us some tips and ideas of how to effectively manage the iterative nature of the human-centered design process?
Yeah, so one really good method that I found is just to have a sort of Kanban board approach to represent the different things that you're doing in each of the phases on either sticky notes or cards. So having some sort of visual representation, and then to also represent your deliverables as stickies or cards. So deliverables meaning like whatever way that you synthesize your research or whatever way that you alter your product. And you want to kind of represent those on the Kanban board. And then you're able to kind of just move the cards back and forth to see where things belong. So for example, if you're working on a particular feature, so one thing is thinking as granular as possible. So if you're thinking at the feature level, so you've already gotten a little further into design and you're at the prototype phase. So having feature X and being able to say, well, actually, there are a few gaps in our knowledge, so we need to, do a little bit more discovery to understand the problem this feature will address in more detail, and being able to move that feature back on the Kanban board, back to the empathize stage, in a visual way is an indicator to your team of where you are on the project. So that's one way to manage it.
That makes sense. So I think like just to throw out there, like in order to do what James said, like project management tools like Trello, that's something that come to mind immediately to probably can help you collaborate with the entire team through this process because it allows you to drag different cards of your task like across different stages in its project management features.
I would also say that a good tip is kind of to split project from product. So if you're in the midst of a project, there are going to be concerns that might not necessarily be relative to the product. So splitting it and having the project management team board and the design or like development board is also a good way. So the use case that I described with the feature level would live on the design or product development board. And then a project board would be something that's more suited for like client concerns or like teamwork or things of that nature.
That makes sense. So now let's talk about data because we are DataWithBill live stream, so we need to touch with data somewhat in every single episode. So what kind of data are being collected during the entire process, and how do you, I guess, analyze those data to make sure that the decisions that you make in terms of design are the most scientific sound decisions that you can make?
Yeah, so in the beginning stages of design, being empathize, define, and even ideate to a certain extent, the data that you're gathering is qualitative in nature. So you're not going to be getting things that are considered to be statistically significant. But the pro is that you're getting a lot of very rich generative data, things that allow you to understand the problem space and to move in the directions that aren't already explored. And what you want to be looking out for here in order to make sure that you're kind of getting sound data is this idea of saturation. So when you start to hear the same things, the same patterns, and the same themes start to surface from user to user or person to person, that is an indicator to you that you have kind of exhausted that problem space. And so you either want to shift the demographic that you're talking to, look for extreme users, or you sort of wrap up that phase of discovery. And later on in the process, when you have an artifact, something that you can prototype and test with users, that is also going to be mostly qualitative data as well. So you want to design those experiments or tests in a scientifically sound way. So making sure that there's not bias, making sure that you have a hypothesis going in, that there's a procedure, things of that nature will help your data to be unbiased. But in terms of getting quantitatively quantitative data or things that are statistically significant in that manner, it's generally quite expensive. So it's something that most shops aren't going to have the capacity to do. But there's also ways that you can do it through remote user testing or things of that nature to get a larger sample size. But generally, you're not looking for sample size. You're looking for richness of data.
That makes sense. Yeah, I was, I think several years ago in Facebook's Human-Centered Design Studio, just like as a study, when I was there, like just witnessing what they've done. And even in Facebook, even though they do like a lot of tests on a daily basis, I talk with them, and most of their design decisions are still very much qualitative in nature. But I do like to point out that after you make design decision, you can test whether the decision, especially on your website, whether those decisions are effective with A/B testing, which will allow you to collect a lot more data in terms of understanding whether the decision you make were actually effective or not, and rapidly change based on the results that you collect from your users. But that's something that goes beyond.
I'm glad you raised that, Bill. There are other tools that you can use as well. So things like Hotjar, Crazy Egg, if it's a web-based product, that will gather data about your product and the way it's performing and how users are behaving around it. And so this is where you would want to have sort of an MVP or minimum viable product, and that way you can, place it live in either like a beta or something like that, and you're able to gather more data like this through one of those avenues.
That makes sense. So now let's talk something like more applicable. For example, like I'm a small, medium-sized business owner. I don't know anything about human-centered design, but it sounds really interesting that what you just said today. So how do I start? What is the first step? Or how do I implement human design principle in my organization if I don't have money or budget to hire like an expensive consultant or human-centered designer?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources out there, luckily, on UX and human-centered design. So a good place to start is IDEO. They have a lot of just open source resources. So the IDEO design toolkit has methods, mindsets, principles that it's kind of like a guide. So it'll walk you through how to do it. And the same thing goes for IBM. IBM has a field research methodology that's human-centered design.
I see.
A lot of other companies have them, and they've put that information out there and really accessible and intuitive guides. In terms of putting together like a quick human-centered design capacity in your agency, I would say the key is to start small, to really know what your goals are, and to just start with one or two methods. So an easy place is just to start interviewing people, just start talking to people that you're designing for. Another easy way to start is running a focus group. So there are ways that you can do it very cheaply. You can do a survey is another quick way.
Awesome, sounds good. I think one thing just to add a little bit on that is that human-centered design is not as scary as it sounds, as it seems. It's just it's approach for you to do business or do design with users' need and desire in mind. So if you are, like for example, a small, medium-sized business owner, just go out and talk to your users. Just talk to, if you have like physical location, talk to them, see what their needs are, and empathize with them to see what you can do to satisfy their needs and make a better product for them. And by engaging these simple process itself, you're already getting started in human-centered design and being more human-centric in your approach to business. So that's not something that's super scary, and that's something you can do like starting today.
Exactly, yeah. And kind of back to the resources, you can, even if you're feeling a little sort of daunted by interviewing or just talking to people, you can always grab an interview guide, and it'll just have like a few best practices, meaning just questions that you can just take and ask the people that you're talking to.
Yep, that makes sense. All right, thank you so much, James, for coming today. And I think this is a great interview because we talked a lot about the human-centered design process, and it will be really helpful. It's actually really helpful for myself as well when designing the Humanlytics products that, for example, like we probably, from this conversation, we probably need to start talking to more users and engaging in more like human-centered approach in making sure that the product we make are actually satisfying the need of the users. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.